All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Kathy Wachala, and I work here in the DC office at RTI. I am really pleased to see the turnout this morning, especially those that are virtual. We have quite a significant number of people that are online watching this from different countries, different time zones, so I appreciate those that got up early or stayed up late to be a part of this. I really think that this is a good moment to be talking about private sector engagement and leveraging the work that we've been doing in conservation with the private sector. I invited a panel of 5 experts that have been working in conservation for a significant amount of time, where they've been seeing the trends, seeing the changes, and how the private sector has gotten engaged to a point where it's well integrated and become commonplace in practice to be working closely with these companies and institutions. So I'm really excited to hear a lot of their experiences. And the way we're gonna set this up, we have a keynote speaker who's going to start first, and then we're gonna go to the panel, okay? So without further ado, I would like to introduce Mary Rowan from Usaid's Forestry and Biodiversity Office. She is the Senior Wildlife Advisor. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kath. And thank you for RTI for arranging this. This is a very exciting and a very timely conversation. And I'm going to challenge this audience and our panel to think about what we're going to do in the future. There we go. Why is USAID invested in this? USAID's a development agency, and as our administrator, Mark Green, says, our job is to put ourselves out of a job. And so that's helping host governments to manage their resources, to manage their development pathway. And a lot of that is through capacity building and through working with private sector and NGOs and others to help build that capacity and that ability to sustain development into the future. And part of that is the mic, it sort of fades in and out. I think we've got 2 competing. Is the focus on natural resources, because that is so much of what underpins development. It's what we need for building, for food, for all our livelihoods. And so what I want to do today is talk about the role of the private sector and development in terms of some of the things that we found from the latest IPBES report. The Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services released a report this year which really gave a sort of stop and really think about it sense of what's happening with global biodiversity and natural resources and the things that we depend on. It is what sustains life. And the report says, and it's an important read that I hope everyone in this room either has read or will look at, is the fabric of life is getting more fragile. We've taken a lot of things out of the system, we've degraded systems, and so we're at a tipping point in many areas. And so how do we work to be more sustainable, to make wiser choices, and manage those resources? And a lot of what we do with on that does involve the private sector. And private sector, there's corporate social responsibility. There's certainly looking at risks with small, medium business enterprises, helping those develop more fully or go into markets that may be a little bit off the norm. And then a lot of the bulk of the work of what we do is helping businesses be more sustainable, work to address issues in their supply chains and help with the policies that inform and how those resources are used. This is a sobering one. There have been 2 reports on pollinators, one a special report on pollinators and then what came out of the biodiversity assessment this year, looking at what's needed for just the regulating services that we depend on. Looking at pollination, this is something clearly where the private sector is engaged and needs to be further engaged, and this is a threat to so much of our food security. And certainly a lot of organic and other producers are looking at how to conserve areas and work with areas for pollinators, but this is an area where we certainly need to think more holistically and look at what's necessary for food security moving forward. 3 billion people depend on wild-caught fish. Some of that is managed, and an awful lot of that is not managed. And so working with private sector and governments to regulate and how to make those practices more sustainable and look at other ways of managing those resources. Forests are another big one, which is both private sector, communities, governments need to pay more attention in terms of how do we manage those resources, both for offtake and for carbon sinks, and all sorts of things like that. So the IPES report talks about nature's contributions to people. Regulating, those are a lot of the things that we get for free that we actually need to put a bit more energy and think of it not as free, but something you need to put money into. Pollinators was one example. We've had an association, Usaid, with Coca-Cola. This was a couple of years ago, looking at how to manage the water resources. So some of it was delivery, but also watershed management so that you have clean water and you have water available. Water is needed for certainly people, agriculture. A lot of areas now are looking at all those dams for hydroelectric that need to focus on the upstream water to make sure that there's water for those dams. A big area where we've worked in the past is in Panama, looking at the watershed necessary for the water to supply the Panama Canal. So working with those communities and private sector to manage those, both the agriculture and the forests, so that you have the water retention for a very important shipping canal to work. In terms of materials, I think that is where we have the greatest probably interaction with private sector and with governments, looking at both sustainability and new ways of doing this, and how do we do this how do we get those materials that we need without degrading more area or fragmenting more habitats? How do we do what we're doing, and how do we do it better? Non-material, this is a lot of what nature-based tourism is focused on. It's spiritual, it's going to see wild places and wild times. This past summer, UNEP, Space for Giants, and the African Union hosted a meeting on wildlife economy summit, and really looking at how to engage private sector more broadly in maintaining and working on the conservation of the areas that this huge global industry depends on, but also that the communities and rely on, and is a huge foreign exchange earner for many governments. In many areas, many countries, it's number 1, 2, or 3 in their foreign exchange. And so how to get the private sector involved in that conservation, how to help build the sustainability of their business, while at the same time making sure that governments can make can earn necessary foreign exchange and manage those parks and reserves better. And it's an area where we need to look at both wildlife friendly, but also wildlife compatible. And a lot of that is, how do you keep rural people able to make a living where they are? It doesn't necessarily have to be wildlife friendly, but it can be wildlife compatible. There are examples, and so working with vocational schools to build trades and involve private sector in those, so that there are opportunities near and around these areas that depend on foreign exchange and this huge ecotourism business. And there are examples of all of these. I think all of us have examples of where we've worked with private sector in these areas. I think the area that's probably the most necessary, that we really need to focus some effort on thinking about, is the regulating. Those systems that we've gotten for free in the past, and how do we maintain those that our businesses and our livelihoods depend on. This is out of the IPES report, and just look at the light blue area. That's the direct exploitation. At Usaid, I work on combating wildlife trafficking mostly, and the direct loss of species is huge. And so I'm going to provide a couple of examples where we've worked with the private sector on that. And just to make sure everyone's completely depressed and sees the urgency of what we need to do moving forward, is looking at this projection of species loss and extinction. And so we really need to work on that area of managing Alliance, which responded to a change in the Lacey Act, which started in 1900 on wildlife, and in I don't remember the year, 2008, it's right there. That's why you have slides. Amended to include plants. And so there's clearly things like wood tables, but it's also the pieces of computerware that have some element of fiber in them, and all these other things needed to be addressed in how to implement the Lacey Act. And so it was an alliance that really looked at what the private sector needed to be able to look at their value chain and see where there are areas that needed to be fixed so that their products could be imported into the US. And these are some of the areas that Usaid, a group of NGOs in the private sector, work to improve the ability of the private sector to be able to continue importing into the US. And so that's very much on the timber and plants. In terms of wildlife, we have a partnership with that whole host of characters at the bottom, looking at the role of the transport sector in the unlawful or the transport of endangered species. Their systems are used by criminals to transport goods both by ship and by sea. And this is a partnership, includes IATA, which is the International Airline Transportation Association. And the job of airlines is foremost to get you from point A to point B safely. And there's very little room to do anything else because that is their job. But we've worked with them closely, and they're very interested in removing or helping to remove the use of their product in transporting wildlife. And so how do you train and work with different handlers along the way, be it the baggage handlers or the flight attendants or whoever, to be able to spot possible instances and be able to know who to report those to in a timely fashion. And so this is an ongoing, we've got a couple more years, but lots of progress looking at major routes and making sure that that training is done. And Megan Hill here is in the back, and so if you have questions on that, you can ask her later. But this is, I just wanted to show this one slide because it's got that great plane with made out of all those wildlife, and the airline industry has done a great job in trying to limit the use of their product in that by criminals. So what I'm going to end here and just say is that we've got a lot of examples of really good work with the private sector and NGOs and government working together to solve problems. There's a lot more to do, and it's at a point where we really need to get all hands on deck, because as this report, the IPBES report shows, is that we're in a very fragile system right now, and there's so much we need to do to limit some of the places where we take things and improve the sustainability where we are. And that helps both the private sector. I don't know, for me, I really want coffee and chocolate in my life, so figuring out that pollinator issue is a big, important thing. And I think we can all figure out things like that. So with that, I look forward to further discussion with the panel. Thanks.
Do you mind? So I will ask the panelists to come up. I'll go in order. Mary will take the first seat. And John Gant, if I can have you sitting in the second. John is the president of the International Conservation Caucus Foundation, or ICCF. We have Grace Gabriel, the Asia Regional Director from IFAW, the International Fund for Animal Welfare. And Steve Montfort with the John and Adrian, he's the John and Adrian Mars Director at the Smithsonian National Zoo and the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. And Jennifer Talbott is the Chief of Party for our Usaid Protect program that is promoting Tanzania's environment, conservation, and tourism. So thank you, everybody, for coming. So what I'd like each of you to do is, if you could please introduce yourselves, give a little bit of background on your work experience, and then if you could answer one question for me, which is, what was your first job, and did that put you into the field of conservation? And if it didn't, what did? So I kind of want to make sure that you do answer what your first job was, not your first conservation job, because this could be an interesting conversation. And just for all of you to know, this is going to be quite informal. I realize we don't have a table, so there is water to your right with cups. So Mary, let's start with you, and we'll just go in order. Okay. If you could introduce yourselves and answer the question.
Sure. I'm Mary Rowan, work at Usaid, and I've worked at Usaid for about 20 years. I started as a AAAS fellow after a postdoc where I was working on reintroduction of wild asses, and I've heard every joke you can make on that. Thank you very much. And at Usaid, I've worked a lot on community-based natural resource management, a lot on dryland conservation, a lot of work with negotiations, and really pretty much full-time for the last 5 years working on coordinating our efforts on combating wildlife trafficking. I am from New York, and but my family spent a lot of time, almost all our time in vacations in national parks, and that's where I actually started a desire to work with wildlife when I was probably about 4. So I'm not going to be very interesting for your question, and really became in love with drylands from working, looking at areas around my grandparents' place in southern Arizona. And my first job, where I actually got a W-2, which we were discussing earlier, there were lots of things before that. I was a seasonal keeper at Chicago Zoo in Brookfield, Illinois, and I learned a lot about poop. But it also really, at that point, I was very much enamored with reintroduction and the work on Arabian oryx in the Middle East, in Oman. And that sort of, I was very, very much interested in the role that zoos play in conservation and captive breeding. And then I went to graduate school and in my fieldwork in northern Kenya, really looked at, I was studying Grevy's zebra, behavior studies, but really looked at the management of parks and what were the issues there. And so got interested more in how to address those implementation issues. So I'll leave it there.
My name is John Gant. I run ICCF globally, which we do 2 things. One, we work through the framework of a caucus, which is a multi-party group of legislators in a parliament, focusing outside the normal committee structure, focusing on international conservation and development, and working alongside the private sector to educate these policymakers to formulate better policies for the people in their countries. In the U.S., we started the International Conservation Caucus Foundation to support the caucus on Capitol Hill, the International Conservation Caucus on Capitol Hill. That got started around 2003. It's the largest or second largest bipartisan caucus on Capitol Hill, from conservative Tea Party to progressive liberal and everything in between. It has the caucus leaders over the years have championed bills such as the Congo Basin Forest Partnership, Tropical Forest Conservation Act, a lot of the illegal wildlife bills. We also run the Secretariat for the Oceans Caucus on Capitol Hill, working on illegal fishing treaties, plastics, and many other different appropriations of international conservation, which I think has tripled. The U.S. has tripled its commitment since that caucus got started. We have similar caucuses globally. We're in 3 countries in Latin America, working 2 over in Asia now, and 11 countries in Africa. The other aspect of our work, which one of our great partners is USAID, is to activate veterans of the U.S. National Park Service, Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, to help countries create management plans and implement those management plans for protected areas, whether they be marine or domestic. And we're in 10 parks in Colombia, we're in Peru, we're through the Caribbean and Thailand, Mongolia, and other countries in Africa doing that. My first internship was, well, maybe my second internship, but I started at ICCF as an unpaid intern, first employee, and I've been with them ever since. So although I've been involved in a lot of family ventures, as a person receiving a W-2, I think it's only been from ICCF from the very beginning, which I guess means I'm in sort of a small bubble here, but I've been able to see the growth and involvement with the private sector with our 4 founding partners, which was WWF, CI, TNC, and WCS, from the early 2000s up to what it is today, and there's obviously been considerable growth. I'm from Langley, Virginia, and wasn't really involved in conservation or the environment growing up. I was much more interested in architecture and art. So, but my interest in U.S. foreign policy and U.S. foreign policy projection led me in to see how natural resources and the management of those natural resources are critical to create a world where you have stable markets and stable government institutions and economies. So that's how I got involved.
My name is Grace Ge Gabriel. Ge is my Chinese family name. I'm the Asia Regional Director for the International Fund for Animal Welfare. My first job is actually with China Central Television. I was producing documentaries to promote Chinese culture and society to the world. But the job that got me into conservation was I was working for another television station in the US, and I got an opportunity to film an IFAW project in China. You probably have all heard of bear farming. It's basically, these are wild-caught bears. They were put in tiny cages and put a catheter into their body in order to extract bile for medicinal use. And IFAW persuaded Chinese government to shut down 2 of the worst farms with worst conditions and rescued 9 bears. And I went to film the opening of the first bear sanctuary in southern China. Just seeing some of these bears, actually 9 were rescued, and one of them had to be euthanized right away because when he was put in the cage, he was a baby. So he was in that cage for decades, and by the time he came out, he didn't even, have collarbone developed to eat on his own. So just watching these bears coming out of the cage, coming into the sanctuary, we threw fruit into the grass, and there's a pool to bring them into the sanctuary. And one bear in particular touched me because he was going back and forth on the concrete path. And every time he put his paw on the grass, it's like electric shock. And that was the moment, and I just felt, what have our people done to wild animals? And so I can no longer be an observer, so that was the moment I persuaded IFAW's founder to let me go back to China and open an IFAW office in China. So that's mine.
Good. Okay, thank you. My name is Steve Montfort, and I've been at the Smithsonian Institution for 33 years. I started my career as I went to veterinary school, and while I was there, I did a master's degree in physiology. I was very interested in doing science, being a research veterinarian, perhaps. I came to the Smithsonian for a summer internship, preceptorship, when I was in my 3rd year of summer of vet school. And basically I came back afterwards. I was invited to do a PhD. So I tell my young people who I'm trying to mentor that I was in school from the time I was in kindergarten until I was 33 with only 1 year off. Ultimately, I had a desire. I grew up in an area, my dad was a Marine. We moved around. I was fortunate to live in places where my backyard was a jungle in the Philippines, and in Camp Pendleton it was the chaparral environment, and I was just exposed to incredible things as a young boy, and nature was something that just really clicked with me. I didn't expect to become a director or a manager or anything like that. I ran a laboratory for 20 years. My specialty was in wildlife endocrinology and studying how hormones, reproduction and how hormones can be used to assess stress and well-being in both captive and free-living wildlife. And I did my PhD on a species called the Elds deer, the Burmese brow-antlered deer. At our Front Royal facility, we have a campus out in Front Royal, which is the Conservation Biology Institute. And I learned everything there was to know about the reproduction of male and female deer. I became one of the top deer physiologists in the world because, in addition to, other than farm deer, we knew how to monitor reproductive cycles, do manipulation of those cycles, do artificial insemination, everything about the male and the female physiology, reproduced offspring with using these advanced technologies. And when I finished my PhD, I felt like I had gone through an hourglass. Like I became more and more specialized. I had a dream of wanting to save species when I was 20, and by the time I was 33, I knew everything about this one species of deer, but I didn't know what their status was in the wild. I didn't know how many there were in the wild. Nobody did. And so it really just occurred to me that my dream was never going to come true if I didn't reverse the hourglass and go the other direction. So I started to, against even my advisor and other people's sort of advice, and this is a career suicide, I began to try to learn more about ecology and policy and education and other things so that I could become somebody who understood the big picture. And so ultimately, I went from being a veterinarian to a physiologist to becoming what I now call myself as a conservation biologist. And so for those of you who don't know what that is, that's really a discipline that's value driven. It's based on the premise that biodiversity and functioning ecosystems are of benefit to humankind and all life on Earth. And so if you look at science as a scientist from that angle, you realize that publishing papers and whatever, which I did a lot, wasn't going to end up saving species in those systems, and it wasn't going to fulfill my career objectives and my life stream. So now I'm a manager of a big place. I'm now the director of the zoo in Washington, but for the 13 years before that, I was the director of the Conservation Biology Institute. Now I'm director of both. So how do you put those two together? First of all, a zoo is about, we're part of the Smithsonian. It's this awesome knowledge institution. It's the world, it's our country's museum complex. And we have an awesome capacity, but we're the only part that has living animals. And with that comes a moral and ethical responsibility, to not only care for them and provide well-being for them, but to connect that work to what you're doing to save them in the wild in the first place. So the Conservation Biology Institute is what helps us to do that. We hope to inspire people, create empathy in people so they will change their behavior, so they will be partners with us in conservation. And on the back end, I have an amazing team of scientists and conservationists, a couple of hundred people. We're working in 25 different countries, really the top group, a zoo-based conservation biology institute really in the world. I'll brag about that. But the fact is, together we're trying to achieve a united goal, which is to help save species, to help save ecosystems. And it's a hard job. But anyway, I'm glad we're doing it. I'm glad my team has got my back. I was a busboy when I was 15. The first W-2 I had, that was back in 1972. I had long hair. I had to wear a wig that I bought from Montgomery Ward's to work with a hairnet, And so that definitely did not lead me to conservation. But something that did is I was at the San Diego Zoo. I did an internship, ultimately ended up being paid. And the reason that inspired me was, first of all, it made me feel like I was smart enough to contribute something to conservation as a scientist, which as an undergrad I had no clue about how to do that. And it was because of a mentor. So it was Bill Lasley. And this was a guy who looked across the table at me and said, "Who are you? Why are you here? And what do you want to do with your career?" And I had no idea how to answer that question. But the power of mentoring is what it really stuck with me all those years. And so about 8 years ago, we founded the Smithsonian Mason School of Conservation out in Front Royal. And we bring in these young people that were like me at 20. And I sit with them and I say, "Who are you? Why are you here? And what's your dream?" And the answer that everybody gives, really, in consensus is, "I want my life to have meaning, I want to make an impact, and I want to be part of something bigger than myself." So that's something that I think is pure, that if we can harness that across the world in a generation that wants to do better, like you're seeing in New York and other places, we can make change happen. So, thanks.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jennifer Talbott. I'm the Chief of Party of the USAID Tanzania Protect Project, and Protect is promoting Tanzania's environment, conservation, and tourism. It's a 5-year project. We're just into our final year right now. And it looks at national level policy issues, institutional strengthening, and working with the private sector. I've been living and working in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa for many, many years now. Before Tanzania, I was in Liberia, and I was in Madagascar, and I was also in Benin. And always been working on, a bit like Mary, on community conservation, protected areas management, and working on rural community development. My first job, I guess my first real job was actually a Peace Corps volunteer. Not even sure if we did get a W-2 or not, but no. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Benin in West Africa, and I started out doing rural community development, a lot of maternal child health, family planning, HIV/AIDS, and little by little started working with some of the hunters and some of the traditional healers who were living and working around a forest. Slowly got into doing more beekeeping training, and then ended up doing a lot of environmental education. And so that's probably the job that took me towards conservation. But I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, but spent most of my summers in Montana. So I think that was a link growing up, visiting Glacier, Yellowstone. I think I did my 4th grade report on the bighorn sheep. And I still took photos and printed them out, and I remember that, and I think that was part of getting me very interested in conservation. But I studied anthropology, and then natural resource management, and then political ecology. So everything I do, I look at it from a sort of an anthropological village sort of point of view, but now more and more from a political lens. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'll just quickly introduce myself. Kathy Wachala, working at RTI here in the DC office. I have been working in international development now the past 15 years, almost 16. I have started out as a Peace Corps volunteer, interestingly enough, in Benin. Jennifer and I found that out when we were in Tanzania, when I was onboarded to help support the Protect Project, which is very cool. I started out, I have my bachelor's in science in environmental science and natural resource management. I thought that was my in. I wanted to become a veterinarian. I went to University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, specifically to go to that vet school. But as getting a Bachelor of Science, it was all research all the time, worked in a lab. My father was a chemist, my mom was a microbiologist. This sounded like the right track, but I am way too social, and I just could not sit in it. And I had so many friends that were going into anthropology and going out doing research by themselves in the field, and now that would be a luxury to me. But back then, that was not what I wanted. So I learned really quickly, too, that to be a vet and from Chicago, I wasn't really going to be working with the animals that I wanted. The cats and dogs didn't interest me. It was actually big cats. So interestingly enough, later in my career, I was able to do that. But in the protections lens and conservation lens, not necessarily needing to doctor them. When after Benin, I still wasn't convinced about development. So I wanted to explore it further. I started working at Commonics International, became kind of a jack of all trades, as you do, working there, which was excellent, because while I desperately wanted to focus on the biodiversity conservation or natural resource management, all of the other sectors that I ended up working in those first 2 years at least got me, just opened my mind to what the interconnection is to all of these sectors and practices. And so when I finally was able to deep dive into conservation, I got to see how all of it relates. Rule of law, public sector, private sector engagement, education, health. The industry, that had really opened my eyes. The majority of my time at Commonics, I was overseas in the field. And when I came back, I consulted for quite a few years, mostly working on proposals and strategy for organizations. And I ended up working with one large private sector organization who was actually interested in creating a subsidiary to work in development. So I helped engineer and design that sister platform for them, which was very eye-opening. And all of this has kind of just led me to eventually working in Bangladesh as Deputy Chief of Party, where we worked with a local organization. It was a Usaid Forward program. So the local organization was the prime, and I was with Smithsonian at the time. We were the sub, and that was a tiger conservation project. So I was able to end up working with the big cats. And then I wanted to come back to the States, as I normally do after I do a field assignment. I find myself wanting to kind of humble myself further. Came back, and luck would have it, RTI was looking for a manager to help with their conservation portfolio, which also focused on CWT efforts, which is something I started working on in Bangladesh and wanted to specialize in. So I think it's really cool where we've all come and gone from. My first job was at a racetrack. And that was all my father's doing when I look at it in hindsight. He brought me to the racetrack. We had gone. This was a favorite place of his. He, as a chemist, he loved math, and he loved numbers, and he was a gambling man. So he always went to the racetrack or the OTB, the off-track betting parlor. He took me one day and said, "Oh, interesting. They're doing a job fair, Kathy. You should go talk to that gentleman over there." And it was public relations. It was guest relations. So it was right up my alley, just in my personality and what I was interested in doing in terms of the sociability of it all. I learned very quickly how to work with delegates back then because that's what I was doing. So at 17, I was already working with heads of state in a different form and manner, but and it was wonderful, and I loved it, and I loved the racetrack. But it also just confirmed to me that it was about protection, not exploitation. So that is my recap on all of that. So thank you guys. I think it really is enjoyable to hear backgrounds and where people come from and how you've evolved and what's emerged out of your lives and what you bring to the table when you do this kind of work. So I appreciate that. Before I start the questions of the panel, I am actually just going to let you guys know a little bit on how we're going to manage questions that come up. We have someone in the back, Stacy, who's working online to look at the questions that are coming from those that are remote. So once I start these questions, I'm just going to kind of lay a base and foundation for everyone on some preliminary questions to the panelists. So we'll refrain from questions from this live audience. But for those of you who are online, please feel free to start populating your requests for questions now. If you are live streaming on that same page, you will see prompts right underneath where you can put your name, where you're coming from, which organization, and then your question. So please go ahead and find that. You can submit at any time, and Stacy will be reviewing those, and we have a microphone for her. So we'll occasionally look back at her and see if she's got anything to add. For those of you in the live audience, I encourage you to please, it's not just questions, it's comments, it's experiences, it's history, it's anything that you would like to bring to the table. I really do want this to be a dialogue once we kind of get the base going with these panelists and really brainstorm together on how to move this forward. Mary mentioned in her discussion with the keynote that she encourages us all to think and look to the future. I even have a few questions catered to that so that we start talking through what is that next step, how are we moving forward with this? And that is something that I ask of you to remember and keep in mind as well. So, all right, excellent. Okay, so I am going to start with a pretty easy question. I would like you guys to please let me know how you have engaged the private sector. Give some background on how you've engaged them. I'm going to start with Jennifer because on the program, it's quite specific. And I would love for you, especially to just kind of talk about maybe how the project originally started in the private sector and how it's evolved.
Okay, so I'm thinking of 3 different types of ways that I've engaged with the private sector, and it's throughout the different countries that I've been working in. The first way has been really, I would call it site-based. I guess I would call it classic public-private partnership. I guess I'll start with focusing on where the private sector also has a core interest in conservation. So it's core, their business is core conservation. And that's been mostly in Tanzania, where we've been working on with 3 private sector tourism operators who rely on the conservation base for their business. And Mary was referring to this earlier, the ecotourism. So one is marine-based, one is more savanna-based, and one is more forest-based. And so we've come together to work with them and leveraging financing, sharing experiences, and it's new, but it's going quite well. So that's sort of one group, is a sort of site-based private sector partnership with organizations who really care about conservation and depend on it. The other type of site-based public-private partnerships I've worked on are working with more, I would, industries and land-based. So mining, titanium dioxide mining of iron, sugarcane plantations, oil palm plantations, where it's not really the core business of the private sector to do conservation, but because where they're working are very biodiverse areas for various different reasons, often with pressure from international bodies, international standards, they need to engage in conservation in some way. So partnering with them. And then the third way that we've engaged is something we're doing right now in Tanzania, which is working with a national level apex organization. It's an umbrella organization called the Tanzania Private Sector Foundation, which is an umbrella organization of all the industry associations in Tanzania. And we've been working with them to insert a strategic objective for biodiversity conservation and combating wildlife trafficking into their 5-year strategic plan. It's been working with them to develop standards for themselves and all of their partners, to train CEOs, to train chambers of commerce, and to provide some trainings, thanks to routes, thank you, Barry, on to airplane sector, logistics, transport, banking, and communication sector. So trying to harness the power and the experience and the reach of the private sector to help on the combating wildlife trafficking. I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, so you might ask, why would a conservation organization want to work with industry? And I have some of our team here, and I want to recognize that they're the ones that have pioneered these approaches. About 20 years ago, we started working with oil and gas sector, and if you just look at the IPBES report and others, you can see by 2050. One analogy is something like 600 and a road equivalent to 625 times around the Earth, or a few million miles of road, which are going to cross through. 90% of those will cross through biodiverse areas. The major drivers of biodiversity loss are, despite climate change coming and adding hurt to the whole equation, is right now is development. And it's something that if we can't deny it's there. And so in our case, if you're going to develop for a linear pipeline development or something like that, and you have a company, and there are companies that want to raise their standards of practice. And so what we've done is we've very carefully found partnerships with companies that are interested in doing the right things and raising the standard of practice. You might question why they would do that. Maybe it's not good for their bottom line necessarily, but you've seen many cases where indigenous people have then come back and sued companies for bad practices decades after they've left an area. I think it's a bit of it's a win-win, because it's almost like an insurance policy. If they do the work up front to understand what biodiversity exists in the system before they disturb it, and then you understand how you can mitigate against loss while you're doing the development, and then you can set goals for restoration post-development, say of a linear pipeline, and you can track that over time, then you have scientific evidence that shows that you were doing the right thing. And so this is what we've done, and we have some, pretty great examples. One in Peru working with Peru LNG with Hunt Oil, but this was a 400-kilometer pipeline over the Andes from sea level up to the top of the Andes and back down. And our team went in advance and assessed the different biogeographic zones across that. You can imagine at different altitudes, you have different species that are there, different plants and animals. They characterized in advance indicator species. They did baseline surveys and assessments, and then during the whole project, we're able to track those indicators. And then post-project, and we've been there for years afterwards, including the port where ships are coming in and loading on. So it's a long-term commitment by a company, but it's where science can be used to ask the question, how can science help inform practices that can be more biodiversity friendly in advance, a priori? And that's the difference. So we enter into agreements. They're research agreements, basically. They're not contracts. We own the intellectual rights to the data. data. They know we're going to publish whatever it is that we find. We've taken a lot of, early on we took some heat for this, but we think it's the right thing to do. Having people inside doing the science as opposed to being on the outside, we believe is the right way to go. And I just finished with something that is a deficit, really. I mean, I've been to these sites. When you have the right partners, it's pretty amazing. But HSE things, health, safety, environment issues. When you go to one of these sites, safety is just unbelievably reinforced. You can't go anywhere. I had a physical exam in Gabon before I went on to the site, and the doctor told me, well, you need to lose weight and cut your sugar intake, or you may not ever be allowed back. But the point is, safety is everything. And so if we can start the mainstream, when they say environment, it isn't really conservation and sustainability. We need to mainstream that so that these kinds of expertise are in the room at the decision table. It's not the outsiders trying to break through. It's partnership. It's there. It's automatically considered in every single project. And we need hundreds, if not thousands, of these kinds of people doing this work right now. Right now we're just at the leading edge of something that needs to be greatly amplified.
Thank you. Grace?
Yes, I think program drove us to work with private sector. The increase in online wildlife trade of endangered species parts and products. The largest marketplace open 24/7, and you can basically from your home, wherever in the world, you can buy things from across the world. And so we started working with Alibaba and its Chinese subsidiary Talbott since 2005. Alibaba was still quite young at the time. And so they were very responsive to working with us when we found endangered species sold online, and we provided to them, and they put in the policy. Alibaba and Taobao banned the trade of parts and products from tigers, rhinos, pangolins, bears, sharks as early as 2008. And since then, their action or zero tolerance policy had motivated many more companies to join them. And in fact, at that time, that kind of zero tolerance policy, basically putting these endangered species on the prohibited from trading list together with weapons and pornography. It was stronger than China's wildlife protection law. And so a year ago, together with WWF and Traffic, and we brought in, basically Alibaba and Taobao and many other companies brought in 34 tech giants around the world into a coalition. It's a coalition to end wildlife trafficking online. And this coalition has a goal of reducing cyber crime of endangered species by 80% next year, by 2020. And the coalition has also, because of their work, because of these companies' participation, had changed policy in many of the countries, in China, in Czech Republic, in Poland, in France, making these countries have come up with laws specifically addressing trading of wildlife parts online. And so this is, it's one of those just kind of a snowball effect from one company, from one part of the world, but now it's global.
So ICCF, we partner with 50, I would say, biggest corporations in the world. Our first one was International Paper, but Volkswagen, ExxonMobil, 3M, Microsoft, a litany of big brand names that people come in contact with day to day. I think what's really important to understand here is the whole ideology behind the NGO sector and the private sector. I mean, the America's business is not conservation. America's business is business. We have great wealth in this country that allows us to do what we want to do in conservation, which other countries can't afford, because we have an incredible for-profit sector. And this has allowed us to have, I would argue, and put money towards the best national parks in the world. I think it's also allowed us to go back and reverse a lot of the issues that we had as we developed when it came to destroying the environment, the type of problems we had in the Midwest with bad agricultural policies, et cetera. So I think when you look around the world, capitalism is the base. The base of wealth creation in capitalism is natural resource extraction. And so we find ourselves consistently working with natural resource extractors, whether from the ag sector, directly from the ag sector, or from the mining sector, or from the oil sector, and governments, to try to figure out what are best practices, what are best policies that will not only ensure royalties for countries, jobs for locals, but also creates conditions where there's an acceptable amount of pollution, whatever that is for the country, an acceptable amount of biodiversity loss, which inevitably takes when you do mining, or when you do oil extraction, or you do agriculture. And I think it becomes more and more really not what the private sector can do for us with writing a check, which is obviously what we all are very happy about, or most NGOs. They get I would say, probably 30 to 40% of their money from the private sector. But really, what do we do for them? How are we relevant to them? And I think our relevance to them is to be able to, a lot of times, is to bring unrepresented stakeholders and unrepresented ideas that leadership might be unaware of to the forefront, so that as some of my colleagues on the panel have said, there can be no unintended consequences for various business practices. More and more, when we're working in Latin America and Africa and Asia, we see, thanks to a lot of the work that NGOs have done on this, and of course the social media revolution, is we see American and European companies that are really trying to play by the rules and really trying to push for consistency in regulations. Looking up at the board that Mary was showing before and talking about regulations, the things companies hate most is when they don't know the future. And so looking at what those consistencies will be in resource extraction, and if they're level playing fields, it's something that they see the NGOs as actually being able to give them by holding everybody to an equal account. So one of I think the crucial roles that we have with our group of corporate partners is a consistent engagement, exchange of information and ideas with the NGO sector and with policymakers who are basically going to regulate these companies, so that it allows for continued economic growth, at the same time with understanding the real costs to business that might be outside their bottom lines, and also for countries that we work in, looking at are they maximizing the royalties on their annuities of natural capital? So are countries really getting the best deal that they can, and do the countries understand the long-term costs and benefits that they're getting from working with corporations? I really like Administrator Green's comment of trying to work ourselves out of a job. I hope ICCF doesn't exist in 20 years, so that we've created those necessary avenues of discussion points, and that companies, when a Walmart decides to make a decision on where it's sourcing its wood, or a extractive industry works with decides that it won't work in certain countries that don't meet certain corruption criteria, that those two decisions will do more work than every single conservation NGO combined ever. So these corporations have enormous power, and I think if we can understand more from how their profit-making models work, and bring that dialogue into how that can be utilized for other development opportunities, I think that's a win-win situation. Other than just the philanthropic model that you normally have seen in the past.
Okay, as government, as purveyors of public funds, a lot of our role is to bring all those players together, working with stakeholders to identify issues, and then working with private sector and NGOs to build that process. The two things that the Forest Legality Alliance and Routes are really looking at that, working with using public funds to foster that process, to bring the players together, help figure out the issues together and come up with workable solutions. And I think both of those examples are the same. But I think those are big, large programs working with industry associations. The same thing happens when you're dealing with, let's say, where I have the most on-the-ground, hands-on experiences with a community lodge working with a private sector investor. And how do you're working on community development. The private sector needs to make money. They need to run a lodge that works. How do you broker that conversation so that there's understanding of language? And that's the big thing, whether you're working cross-sectorally in terms of integration or whether you're working with the private sector and NGOs and government is making sure that everyone understands what you're actually talking about and that coming up with those shared goals. So I think that's a lot of where public funds come in terms of our role working in development is how do you foster those conversations so there's an understanding of purpose and that you can work to raise industry standards, develop best practices, and how does that sort of work on scaling up? So I think those are some of our roles.
Thank you. I'm going to stay seated here just so everyone knows. I think some takeaways on just listening to you and also some of the preliminary conversations I had with the panelists, a few highlights I have, especially for Jennifer and Steve. I think what's really fascinating about this is looking at how to engage the private sector in finite time. Because frankly, I've done research, even working in Bangladesh with researchers, so much of it was just over decades we will know this, or over this certain time of period of time, my apologies, but Usaid Protect has 5 years. And the working with the private sector in the oil and gas industry, they want to get going on their pipeline. No matter how long it takes, at the end of the day, that's money to them. So you guys have found a way to kind of review and look through a lens of time as well. What's temporal here? What can we do in a certain amount of time? And that's also, I think, an advantage and a challenge with USAID programs is you're there with a snapshot. So what has been going on, what's working, and how are we going to actually take it to another level where it's going to be substantive enough in the time that we have and yet sustainable? And throughout my entire career, the conversation in proposal writing, in adaptation, in managing programs has been, where is the sustainability on all of this? And I do feel like we're starting to see that a lot more. Grace, with your example, IFA has such a great reputation in China, especially. You have fostered these relationships over time. And to know that Alibaba walked in and you explained what was going on and they were open to it is impressive in its own right. So some of the conversation, it would be great to also just hear, have there been any conversations that have been difficult? How did you get through those challenges and kind of go triumphant? And I'll get back to that in a minute. John and Mary both lent the conversation a little bit at one point to the relationship with the private sector also. In terms of environment, the more we take away from the environment, the less some of these private sector companies are going to be able to resource. You're looking at those that are extracting, and that is also finite. No matter how large that pool is, we're starting to see the scarcity of it. So I would be interested also to hear a little bit, John, from you on what other, in some of your conservation caucuses, what experiences you've had where you're seeing that they see the value of getting involved because otherwise they're not going to continue making a profit. So if we could get a little bit into that, I would ask, what are the key factors from your experiences that go into these private sector relationships. What makes it, and some of you have already said this, and it was a common theme throughout the preliminary questions, what makes it a win-win? So what are those key factors you've noticed in those relationships? And I just welcome whomever is available to answer to go ahead and speak.
I could start. I mean, I think it's you have to build relationships and trust, especially if you're in the case of doing, talking about conservation. Many of them in the private sector have been attacked by conservationist NGOs over time, and so we're perceived as being the enemy to some extent. And so personal relationships are really important. In our case, it's first you need to get an in the door, and so the way that's happened is through we build our reputation, we get references from other people. Some companies may be going for financing, the IFC or World Bank or Inter-America Development Bank or something, and they need a reference. They're giving a reference for their financing to take a look at us. But what we do is we try to build relationships on a personal basis with the company. We embed ourselves functionally within the environment of the company, and you have to understand what it is their objectives are. And then it's not just doing science for science sake. It's asking the question, how can science inform the decision making that you're going to do during your development? And one of the things that's really satisfying is that we don't have to wait years for results. We're asked to tackle problems. Could be how do you create Tremi here in the front is an expert in creating canopy bridges in corridors, or how do you understand how to do those things in real time? How do you want to move the pipeline from here to here to have an offset that won't be as negative? So those things we can do the research in a relatively short period of time, and we can see the results of that, and it's implemented, and then that's something that's very helpful to the company. It doesn't slow the process down. I think the thing that's long-term, though, is if a company wants to make a claim that says we're going to do this pipeline and there's going to be no environmental impact over the next 10 or 20 years, well, then that's a problem, because you can help them develop the pipeline as well as you can during the development. But if you don't first know what biodiversity exists in the first place, you don't have a baseline to measure against, then you're not actually able to make a claim of restoration. So if you want to say you're going to restore this pipeline right away back to its natural state with a certain percentage of native species and so on, you have to know what species were there, and then you have to track it. So it does require a longer-term commitment. That's one of the things that I think we're not going to get away from in some context. So I think that's it's building trust, building the relationship, showing the value of what you're bringing to the table. And some of the challenges are turnover. We've been in some places in the Gamba complex for almost 20 years, and every few years there's a new site manager, CEO, and you have to reestablish relationships again and again and again, even though we have the continuity on our side. So it's workable, but it really boils down to there's no substitute for building trust and personal relationships. You need to become like an insider, but by maintaining your independence, so that you can sort of speak truth to whatever is going on in the process.
Grace.
Yeah, trust is really important, and also that personal relationship on top of that is also recognizing that you are part of this society. You are here for the long haul. You're not an NGO just from sitting outside of China pointing fingers, being always critical, but you are trying to help create that change from within the country. I think it's very important, particularly for countries like China, that quite often is on the other end of the criticism. So for an NGO to approach them and elevate that personal relationship to a relationship of, this is something that we can influence society, basically, but influence society in a way that's very politically sensitive, culturally relevant, socially motivating. Those type of campaigns attract private sector support.
Yeah, I would just add to what you said. I agree on the trust. The trust is key, the personal relationship. I would also add that communication, early communication, and all sorts of different types of communication. We've had several instances where we thought we were communicating and we thought everything was fine, and then we realized we actually had two very separate ideas about how the partnership was actually going to move forward. And so we had to then quickly reestablish, let's open everything up again, talk about it again, make sure we have clear communication lines, bring it back together. And we had this turnover also in leadership, and then having to reestablish the communication lines. So in the 3 partnerships we're currently working on, there's been sort of, I would say, a nice beginning phase, and then a definite dip as things got wobbly, and then much stronger, and then moving forward.
Yeah, I would just add to that. We always talk about having a champion of maybe on our team that is the person who's really motivated, who's taking the torch, going to lead the way. But you need that same champion on the other side. And when you lose somebody like that, and you have to restart, that's tough. But you have to have somebody inside who shares your vision and understands that there's a win-win there for you.
Break it down a little bit more. Certainly trust is a huge part, communication, but in that communication, really what we mean is over time is being able to speak the other's language. I'm from the government. I can speak 5 minutes in acronyms and not say actually words. But that doesn't help when talking to the private sector or to others. And so that long-term relationship really means that you're learning the other's language, and you can talk in ways that are important to them. Because if you can't explain your issue in their language, then you're not going to work. And that's what that long-term relationship is. It's that language building. And so there are ways to make that quicker, but that is a large part of it, is because everyone has their own red lines, their own, their boundaries that they can go in. As soon as you can understand that and explain your issue within their boundaries, the chance of success is much higher.
Definitely. I mean, I think just also being a private investor and having some other people on my staff who have been our private investors, I think brings us a little closer together to be able to talk the finance and bottom line type of language. To answer your question, I thought was a really great question. I think in a lot of ways, some of these big companies are terrified, especially in this social media age, and there's examples of this. But if you're a big chocolate company and you know where you're getting chocolate from, it's almost impossible to really know where that's coming from in Africa, in a place like Ivory Coast. You know that probably there's a portion of this that it has been planted in illegally deforested ways, and that is terrifying. For a well-known coffee brand, having a child worker in Mexico that is picking coffee beans when they're supposed to be in school, terrifying. For a gold company or information technology company that's building hardware that's using gold, and its inability to trace it back to exactly where is it coming from, knowing that could be illegally mined using mercury. I mean, these things are very, very big issues that they're thinking about in the boardrooms every day, and they are really trying to mitigate. We saw this many, many years ago when I was a kid with Nike and other apparel manufacturers in China and Asia that were using child labor, and how this really caused a big hullabaloo. Well, that's just gotten larger and larger and larger. And I think that these companies are looking at ways that they realize that potentially the best way to get, rather than just government regulation, which is one part of it, but doing having partnerships with NGOs, with several of the organizations here that are on the ground in these places that can help monitor, that can help say, hey, are you looking at these issues, or this is a better way where this is not going to happen, or how about we all get together and create a strategy to focus on combating illegal mining or combating illegal forestry or illegal fishing. So a lot of these illegal extractive industries that they might be sourcing from can easily make its way with one photograph to social media. In the same instance, I think NGOs from our recent front page news in the papers are also concerned to make sure that this can also happen to them, where they might be doing or not knowing things that are happening in their own organizations as they're trying to combat a lot of this illegal extraction. So I think social media and the ability for information to travel very, very fast is something that brings unlikely bedfellows together to try to, on both sides, to make sure that they're working together to, have each other's backs, if you will. And I think that is a strong motivator.
But you don't think that turns over so quickly that companies can say, well, if there are a few blips.
That's okay. I just did want to say, and we can open it. We do have microphones. We weren't quite ready for it, but let's get you a microphone so we can. No, please. Jenny, do you mind if you could just repeat the question so we can get it for the remote audience? Yeah, thank you.
I was just saying that it seems to me that there's so much information coming through on social media that a company could, as easily as they could be concerned about it, they could also say, but the next day's news cycle is going to erase it. I don't know if that's the case, but it just seems like.
I think if you're a mainstream consumer brand that has a very strong identity where a lot of your market value is, or a good portion of it is brand, retail, where you're dealing with that every day, I think that is one of the things that they're most concerned about. And I think one photograph can spell a lot of trouble for these brands. Of course, there's people say, but I think in general this is something that many companies have woken up to. One whistleblower can really bring down the value of a company and really have to put it in a position to spend a lot more money than it would have by just mitigating it in the first place. There are fly-by-night operators. There are people that are not, let's say, brands that are well-known, which are many of the brands around the world. People, not necessarily global brands, the people that are selling, et cetera. I think at the end market, whether you look at, a big brand like Apple and where they're getting, I think that they're being more seen as having to be responsible for where they're actually getting all their parts and how those parts are being manufactured and where they're being extracted from. I think in Nestle, the biggest food company in the world, the same way. I think of Starbucks. I think that people really will put a lot of the pressure on that end user right before that end company right before it hits the consumer. So I think that's my experience in the last 10 years especially.
I just have 2 comments and 1 question, and then I'll open the floor. So one of the things I wanted to ask was from Jennifer. In Usaid Protect, I wanted to just see if you could give an example. You had said there's 3 ways that you engage the private sector. There's one specific that has really been, to me, that demonstrable win-win, where there's an organization or private company interested in the conservation in the area. With regard to tourism, can you give us that example?
So, one example of a site-based public-private partnership where it is in the interest of the private sector, really a core value, is a tour company that we've been working with, where they actually have a vision of wanting to make sure that there are animals around, especially elephants around for the tourists to see, right? So it's really in their core business interest. If there aren't elephants, then there won't be that much business for them. So they'd already been engaging in certain protection things like patrols, rangers, these types of things. So they already had actually invested quite a bit of their own money, their own profits back into the conservation of this area. So we saw quite a lot of commitment from them. And we started to dialogue with them, and this is where the time and the trust and the personal relationships, because it probably took about 2 years of going to see them coming to see us, going back, talking about certain ideas, then realizing that wasn't going to work, then we were talking with USAID. So it really probably took 2 years until we finally found something that was really important to them and something that was important to us and how we could actually put this partnership together. And ever since then, it's been pretty smooth sailing once we had the vision and the trust and the relationships. And there have been ebbs and flows and ups and downs. But I think it's because we now trust each other and we now realize we have the same vision for this area. We really both want protection of the area, and we've been supporting them a lot to strengthen their relationships with other authorities, government authorities, other potential donors, other partners, trying to strengthen actually their internal management so that our project is just a project. We'll be finished in a year, but that after that they'll be ready to move on. They'll be able to work with the government partners better. They'll be able to get other donors. They'll be able to solicit donations from their high-paying guests more often, with the idea that we've had this partnership. It's kind of gotten them going and strengthened them, and then we're stepping back and we're done.
I think what's really cool about that example is they are actually based, their site has a permit available to hunt, but that is not the way that they use the land at all. So they actually could be also creating revenue with the hunting license and getting good money from that as well, you could argue. But that is not how they're doing it, and I think that's really impressive. I wanted that example because, as Mary indicated, some of this is higher level, which is actually really good and impactful because we have to be scaling this stuff up. But there are these monumental pieces that happen in communities, in rural areas, in a place like Tanzania, that are just as impactful and important, and to show that sustainability factor after the program. To also lend another conversation about how long it took to create and foster this relationship, another piece of that puzzle is this concept that we are, and somebody mentioned it on the panel, that still, it was Steve actually, that still conservation is almost on the outside. I had recently gone to a conversation on governance and conservation, and a lot of people that had been speaking in governance, and we did have Usaid on the panel as well, stated that in so many ways, it's almost like conservation was outside this box of all of the things that are included and incorporated when talking on governance. But we have to realize conservation is the box. The environment is the box. It is one of, if not the major resource that where we're talking about governance and protection and how we get these resources. And to lend itself to John's point, where he's working with a lot of companies that are actually extracting, one of the cool conversations I had with one of your staff members was about your marine caucus, and which is relatively new if I remember correctly, and the concept of working with these large companies that are extracting fish resources, and they're actively working with you on the governance and policy reform, because frankly, that makes them, if everyone else has to follow what they want to do in terms of receiving quality products from the sea, and also ensuring that they have a higher level of expectation on the policy level, they want their competitors to as well. So they're advocating for that policy reform so that they have an even playing field competitively, if that made sense. Otherwise, John can articulate that much better, I'm sure. But that was good. That was a
Perfect.
Good gist,
Yes.
right? So now I would love to open the floor to questions. We have two microphone gurus here. We've got Jenny and Lily, so they will walk around if you have any questions. And I just open the floor also to comments, conversation, your stories as well, so that we can gain good insight into your experiences.
Hi, thanks everybody. Is this working? My name is Scott Bodie. I'm an independent consultant. In some of my past lives, I've worked for USAID. Mary and I have worked together in a former bureau called EGAT. There's a lot of threads here, but I kind of like to focus in on one of my favorite places, and that's Liberia. And and Jennifer, I know that you have experience there, and I've seen your name, and maybe we've met or talked. But so I have, some of you know, maybe Mary, I have an on and off again relationship with Liberia dating back to right after the war ended. So I worked on the first RFP that led to, I can't remember the name of the acronym, that shows you how long I've been out of government. That was basically the forest reform program in Liberia. So one disconnect that I see, and people have mentioned illegality, I would say informal production. One of the things I've noticed in places I've lived and worked in Sierra Leone and Liberia is that the informal sector is essentially illegal, okay? And the domestic timber market in Liberia is completely illegal. And my observation over the 10 years, either working as a donor or as an implementer, has been that the conservation community in Liberia, and I want to hear Jennifer's take on this, and the commercial timber part of that sector in Liberia, it was either massive round log exporters or people focused on like getting the parks back up and running in Liberia. So fast forward from, let's say, when I helped write the RFP 2006, 2007 to 2016 or 2015 when I re-entered kind of the picture in Liberia, what I noticed was in talking to local local furniture makers, timber manufacturers, no one from the development community over that past 8 to 10 years had ever come to talk to them about where they source their products. So I was like, okay, what happened? Why are we not engaging with a sector in the Liberian economy that's directly impacting biodiversity in a negative way? And nobody could really give me a straight answer. So that's over to you, Jen. I mean, what did you notice this? What was your role? We could talk about this later, but that really stands out for me. So
Okay.
Sorry.
Maybe I'll give a quick answer and we can talk more.
Okay.
We can talk more later. So I haven't actually been in Liberia since 2015, so I don't know the latest. The most recent USAID project there was called FIFES, if I can remember what it stands for. But the idea was to do more work with products and
I worked on that.
You did, okay. Well,
Still.
okay. So I think that the design of that was a response to this, which is why are the biodiversity people here, and then you've got the timber extractors here, and it's just kind of a fight. So I think that was a response to a lack that was seen. I mean, that being said, when I was there from 2011 to 2015, it was very, very difficult for people in the development community and the biodiversity community to even have a civil conversation with anyone in the timber extractive industry because of the history and the tensions and the personalities. So that it wasn't happening. Now, at a very, very, very local level in some of the community forestry areas, those conversations were absolutely happening about how to harvest the timber and who's the local guy and where is he getting it from. So those were happening on a local level. But I mean, some of the most tense meetings I've ever been in were at the national level between the timber harvesters and the conservation folks. But I'd love to talk more later.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments?
Hi, my name is Ben Spivak. I'm with the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, and so we do some work on the Routes Partnership, as well as looking at counter-wildlife trafficking through the publicly available information, and also looking into illicit timber and mineral extraction. And so my question is for Ms. Gabriel. You've talked about using online platforms or working with private sector companies to take counter-wildlife or wildlife trafficking ads and trade offline. And as somebody who uses the open source for my investigations, my thought there is, could this be used in partnership with law enforcement to identify, from one account to go and identify other potential points of trade online and potentially even take that offline and find the person attached to the screen name. And so my question is, to the degree that you can speak about it, have there been those partnerships with law enforcement, between private sector and law enforcement to take that data and action it?
That's a great question. Actually, it has been happening. When we started working with these e-commerce sites, we have been monitoring the open source, and we found that there is a sustained reduction. And then about 2012, we start noticing, even before that, 2010, we noticed that some of these trades are shifting to search engines. even Baidu, which is China's Google, Baidu has these 13, they call it bars. It's like a forum. There's a tiger bone bar, there's an ivory bar, there's a rhino horn bar. They are specific talking about trading these species. So we approached Baidu, and Baidu was also, again, removed them. And so these are still things that we could see. And then in 2012, we noticed that the trade is shifting into social media, which is much more private. You have to befriend someone in order to get in. And also the trade was shifting towards pictures and audio rather than words. So we started a collaboration with Tencent, which owns the WeChat and QQ. And so Tencent was able to go in. They could go in from the back door behind. And in fact, Tencent has been, as of end of last month, they've removed over 1 million listings, infringing listings. They have also removed over 6,000 accounts. And on top of that, they have also supplied over 80 special cases. When they see the trade volume is big and they felt that this is significant enough, they supply the information to law enforcement. And last year, there was a big case as a result of the information from Tencent, which was a pangolin case, and over 200 suspects were arrested from that. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Hi, this is David Sparrow. I'm from RTI. I'm going to ask you guys to walk to the edge of your expertise. It's always great to hear from you. I thank you all for being here. We've moved the needle a little bit. There's a lot more to do with regards to private sector engagement. So what questions are you guys asking yourselves and asking your teams about what questions we need to answer to really push the needle on getting the private sector as a whole as a partner rather than having individual examples of success? How do we then kind of amplify it, make it bigger? What don't we know that we really have to figure out? So I'm interested in kind of like what you guys are looking to learn.
The first thing is that as a conservation NGO, we live in a tremendous bubble without a lot of diversity of thought or experience. Very, very passionate people, usually started off young in age, animals and environment at the center place in their life. And if you look at really a lot, and politically, we're involved in politics, started out in Washington, et cetera, one side of the political aisle. So if you look at any NGO in general, it's one of the least diverse places that you could probably think about working. People, for the most part, think the same, have similar experiences, usually an uncomfortable or a lack of knowledge from the private sector. So I think one of the things, rather than just trying to educate the private sector, I think it's bring the private sector into the NGO, is to go and look and try to hire people that do have those experiences. One of the things is looking at people who are coming toward their end in retirement in big companies that have made, a little bit of money and want to continue to do work and can come in and really become part of the fabric and say, hey guys, things that you can't even imagine or really train yourself for, this is how we made decisions here in the private sector. I remember a person that worked for me many years ago who wanted to get big agricultural companies to be more held to account. And I said, and he asked me where he should do with his career. I said, go work for Monsanto. He says, what? But they're the enemy. I said, no, go work for Monsanto, go work for ADM, go work for those big companies that you think are creating the issues. You might still believe that afterwards, but at least you're going to know how the inside works. You're going to have an appreciative of the way they view on things. So I think this is something that you're really not going to be able to learn that much about the private sector in so much of a ways to engage with them better and better unless that barrier is brought down. And I think in the same way, people that are in NGOs should look at working in the private sector for a couple years. And what I mean by that is working in extractive, working in an agriculture firm, or a tourism firm, whether it's large or small. And I think that will really help build bridges and an entire new mentality moving forward. And I think an appreciation, because sometimes just as much as maybe we are afraid to work with them, I've met so many of these big private sector companies who will call me and say, hey, we've got a meeting with this big NGO tomorrow, we're so worried. Why do they want to come and meet with us? And should we not, you're thinking like you're talking to somebody about to go on their first date. They're just so nervous. And you say, calm down, no, we're normal people too. So I think that just in the hiring process and the diversity of thought is just something that really has not been done. But managers and CEOs and directors within these organizations have the ability to put it into the hiring process.
Yeah, I would say we have a School of Conservation, and what we've sort of the realization we have is that we're not training the right kind of people. And ultimately, we've been for a long time now training people to be conservation biologists and specialists in conservation. And if we want to mainstream conservation into development practice, we need to mainstream conservation into education. And what our idea is to create a major that will start in 2021, where undergrads will come into a broad conservation major, but it will include, it's going to focus on problem solving. So what we need to be training people is to how to think critically, how to understand how to solve problems, and across all different sectors. So we're hoping to attract students that have an interest in conservation, but may also have an interest in law or business or economics or whatever it might be. So that as they come through the pipeline, they're starting out with a general worldview of I want to live in a better world with biodiversity and all of that, but yet they can make it. We're trying to get people to think that you can make a difference in all sectors of society. We're never going to have cross-sectoral engagement if we don't mainstream this into thinking. So this is our idea. They would come through, they'd be focused on a problem, they would start solving that problem as an undergrad. They'd have like a senior project to basically report out on how do they do, and we place them in internships in all kinds of different sectors. And we think those are the kind of graduates that are going to be very attractive and that will help to start infiltrating different sectors. That's what we're going to do. We think we're building the wrong pipeline. We're building the wrong kind of student with too focused, not broad enough perspectives in different sectors.
I think for us, a lot of it is working within. I would like my Bureau for Food Security colleagues to talk to their implementers about pollination and the need to have wild spaces conserved for those pollinators. For people in the energy sector looking at the upstream watersheds when you're talking hydroelectric. That's where we really need to focus, because this is, so often environment or conservation, it's like those tree huggers. But it really is everyone's issue. And so how do you mainstream it across, I think is the big goal.
Grace.
Also, just to add to that, when you build these relationships with private sector, not only ask them to help you address something that's very urgent, like removing the listings or removing accounts, but ask them to help you strategize how your, into the future, tech companies can bring in so much, ideas. They can provide us with big data to help gather information. They can help, identify social trends, or use AI to pick out, the pictures listing, illegal listings with pictures or text, not text, pictures and audio. And it's just bring them into our big picture strategy development and have them help us find solutions.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, Barbara.
I think you guys have all made a very compelling argument for the power of the private sector. And I personally have a governance background. Did I introduce myself? I'm Barbara Rossman with RTI. I forgot to say that. I would love to hear examples of successes you've had of harnessing that private sector power to really influence government, because they've got to create the legal and the institutional and the regulatory environment in all of these countries to enforce and reinforce the value of conservation as well. And I think all of you are in a unique position to be a bridge in that conversation. So where have you had particular successes in doing that?
Massive success, massive success. I mean, this is what we do on a day-to-day basis. I'll give you a very small example with the Lacey Act. When they were looking to gut that Lacey Act because there was a private sector partner who had a bad experience, maybe a legitimate bad experience, a lot of my friends on the Hill in the Republican Study Committee I went to go see, and they said, John, you can solve this problem right now. I said, how's that? You see, and he pointed to a brochure I had with me, those 50 logos at the back of your brochure. Have 3 of those CEOs call my boss, and it's done. And so that's private sector. I mean, those are the people that have jobs in those areas, especially on Capitol Hill. If you want to formulate policy, you're going to have to bring the private sector behind you, and they can be a great, asset when you find aligned objectives. Similarly, on illegal fishing we were talking about before, if you put those at the table, the big fishing companies, it's going to create comfort. When we do a lot of events with members of Congress and their staff over a given year, and every time we invite right, left, center, et cetera, when they come to a room, we want them to see business there. We want them to see NGOs there. We want them to see other probably members of the administration there, so they find it as a safe space, not just one side of the issue. Another big accomplishment is on illegal mining. So the majority of gold mining in Colombia is illegal. In Peru, it's bigger than cocaine. And we work with Usaid and there to help mitigate it. But by bringing the Anglo-Gold Ashantis of the world and the Ashmonts into the Congress to say, hey, we're completely against this, and we're being labeled with this brush because local communities don't know the difference when they hear about these types of illegal activities. A lot of new legislation was able to be passed with heavier penalties to people that were using mercury, specifically organized crime. So that's directly resulting, and those people have tremendous power, and it's great because I always find it a lot easier to work with corporations and NGOs, because corporations and business people are thinking about one thing. In NGOs, it might be thinking, oh, well, our framework's better than their framework, and they want to discuss, the long-term conceptual context of biodiversity over 3,000 years. It gets very, very complicated. With a business person, when you're in front, they're talking about profit. So align long-term profit, long-term sustainability from a marketing perspective, from a sourcing perspective, you get their attention very quickly. I think some of the examples show illegal wildlife trade. I think there's been a great outpouring of support from the airline communities, from eBay, from others, retailers, et cetera, to get involved in that. But I think it's crucial. I know in the U.S. context and in other countries we work in, Mozambique, which Exxon and used to be Anadarko, now it's Occidental. There's they have GDP of about $7 billion in Mozambique, 3.5 of which is foreign aid. Exxon and Occidental are projecting in about 3 or 4 years' time to give $20 billion a year in royalties to the government. So who do you think has power in that country? Who's going to be able to, say to the country, hey, by the way, yes, we're interested in this, but also our CEO's not so happy about the way you might be doing this or that. So that's very important, I think.
Grace.
Yeah. And also just to add, there's that peer pressure. Peer pressure among companies themselves the coalition against to end wildlife trafficking online. Out of the 34, all of the big giants are in it: eBay, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Instagram. Now we have more joining from Africa, and from like Mall of Africa is also part of that. And this is one kind of peer pressure among that industry group. But also there's peer pressure from the private sector to the government. And sometimes I see that the influence from this group have already created that industry is ahead of them. And they are responding to that by coming up with stronger policies. So, yeah.
I think, Jennifer, if you could go back to that organization, the private company, because I think what was remarkable when I went into the field was watching them at the table with you and others in the community, pretty much brainstorming on the next conversation they were going to have with the government and how they were going to present together. If you could just...
With the local government. This example, I think because this particular example, this company, they're based and they live in an area and they're dependent on the district, a municipality, or the district government, that they have to have very good relations, not only with the village government, with the municipal government, with the regional government, in order to basically have their environmental social license to operate and continue to remain in that area. So de facto, they have to have that relationship. Now, what's interesting is that many of the other operators, tour operators, hotel operators in that area don't have any relationship basically with the government. They just have their land, they just have their lodge, and they're done. But because this company has been doing much more to actually influence the conservation of the area, in terms of protection and rangers and patrols and that they, they're talking all the time with all the local government leaders. I think what we've been able to do is also help them move beyond that to strengthen relationships with higher national level government officials in research and policy, and so that they're also aware of what's going on and also able to support them.
Do you feel that relationship they have with the government, other tourism companies are seeing that and realizing that relationship might benefit them as well? Do you think that it's easier for them to just not involve the government, or?
I think one of the other partners we're working with, a marine partner, they also have a lodge. They also have a very, very strong relationship with the local government and the district, the municipal government, where they're working too. I think it's because they're in a remote place and they're a big business for that place. They employ a lot of people locally, and so it's in their best interest to have very strong relationships across government, and that's enabling them to move forward. And actually, they've taken some of the former government officials who've retired. I like the suggestion, who retired, and now they brought them in on their team. So that's also helped really strengthen that.
And you see that on a lot of Usaid programming. You do see sometimes even those being seconded from the government to work with organizations or companies or projects. And I think that really does help shed light on the perspective from the government side, and frankly, for the government to see what this kind of organization or project is trying to do, especially if it influences with private sector to the government. Steve, I have one question specific to you, and then I have one kind of final question, unless there is anything else from the audience. We'll get to that in a second. So Steve, in terms of the oil and gas companies, when you do all of this research with them, is the research their property? Is it Smithsonian's? Is it public? Does that information get maybe to the governments in the countries with which you work?
Right, we enter into, they're called structured research agreements. Basically, they're not typical contracts. So so with respect to the Smithsonian, we receive funding from appropriated funds from the U.S. government. We're not an executive branch, but we're subjected, we voluntarily subject ourselves to freedom of information, for example. So everything we do is going to be publicly accessible one way or the other. So the companies that we enter agreements into, we have intellectual ownership of the data we collect, and we can publish it in any format that we choose. Of course, if we published something that was displeasing to them or whatever, they could decide to not renew a contract or something like that. But that's, of course, not our intent. Besides, just often peer-reviewed publications are great for scientists, but they're not necessarily the best way to communicate to wider audiences. So we do a lot of work on trying to communicate our scientific data, interpret it for broader audiences. So we do more traditional things like books, and we have, a lot of it is focused on, imagery, for example. You're talking about biodiversity, imagery, photographs can be very powerful to tell a story about what is in this region that people don't understand. We talk about getting baseline data, but most people don't even know what species exist there to begin with. And that can be an eye-opener to people. So yes, we own the data, but we don't use it, we don't try to weaponize it. I mean, I suppose if there is a fear probably of that, and that often takes prolongs our negotiations when we have these kinds of agreements so that people understand that we're different than most. We're not a contractor for you. We're not here we don't work for you specifically to do a task. We're a partner with you in terms of the science that we bring. So we have a different approach. But we are trying to mainstream the science into their development practice in a way that is a win-win. But in terms of publishing, they give up the rights to whatever data we collect. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, question over here, and then we'll come this way.
Yeah, hello, my name's Jeremy Swanson. I'm with EcoDit, and I help manage the Usaid Green Animates project in Vietnam, which works a lot with trying to, more at the community level, so my question's kind of maybe more Mary and also Jennifer. Looks at supporting small businesses, leveraging private-public partnerships for biodiversity outcomes. I'm wondering if we have assumptions, or if we can talk about assumptions we might have that supporting small businesses around protected areas, even in conservation-friendly enterprises, inherently leads to biodiversity outcomes. And if sometimes there's a gap there missing at the community level. To give you an example, I kind of had an impromptu focus group discussion around a campfire in the Congo with a bunch of quote-unquote poachers. All of them had jobs in the tourism industry. They were all working in the tourism industry, and they were telling me about how they loved to go out at night and hunt forest buffalo and what they did to hunt elephant. No connection at all between their kind of part-time job in the tourism industry and their other side job in poaching and getting bush meat to Point Noir and other places. I've conservation ag, met farmers who, oh great, now that I'm getting supported by this NGO, I have money to buy poison to kill those elephants who keep raiding my farm. So I'm wondering if you've encountered some of those, that we have assumptions sometimes when we're making some of these kinds of partnerships and support, and then what are our approaches to overcome some of those challenges?
Sure. And those are very real problems. I think, it gets to a lot of what people talk about as alternative livelihoods. And that's an alternative, probably an additional livelihood. But the question is, it gets to behavior change, how do you stop one livelihood and concentrate on another? And if you're talking about rural poor, they may have a livelihood that enables them to feed their family, but they also want a cell phone, they also want things. And so livelihoods are alternative. Everyone, a lot of people have two jobs. And so the question is how in that process, if your funding is with biodiversity funds, how do you do the education, the behavior change to stop a destructive behavior? But if you're only offering a livelihood that adds a little bit, it needs to be more than that. It needs to make it so they don't have to do their other job. And I think that's a mistake that many go into. It's like, okay, you can do beekeeping. It's like, well, I could do beekeeping on the side and still do this other stuff. And so when you're talking about development, it's really improving the lives of local people to have a better life. And so it's alternative or substitute, but it has to be at a level that enables them to stop their destructive behavior. And you do that by making a livelihood that's workable, but also having the education of why possibly killing wildlife may hurt your ecotourism job or something like that. But I think quite often people think of alternative livelihoods, people are going to stop their second job. It's like, no, they want more. Everyone wants, to have their standard of life go up. So that's a hard one.
I agree completely. I would just add that in Madagascar on one project. It was working around the eastern forests, and it was a biodiversity project, but it was working with farmers, with farmer groups. And they created the farmer groups as a way to address some of this behavior change. And they basically signed an agreement that if you were going to be part of this farmers group, you were going to practice certain kind of conservation agriculture, you were not going to clear. I mean, it was not 100% successful, but I think it was a good attempt at actually being quite upfront with why this project is here, why we're doing this, what we expect. But they had to, get away from the small beekeeping and really get into fundamental, business value chains and look at the market demands and really create quite a bit of extra income. And then also look at the other social, cultural, political factors that was leading to a lot of the basically forest clearing, which really had nothing to do with economics and livelihoods. It had to do with social and cultural and political statements.
There's one other example are community conservancy models, which are being rolled out in Kenya, in northern Kenya, Masai Mara, also in other countries as well. And I think the idea is there are private, small-scale private sector elements to that, but it's also governance control and basically community action on enforcement and things like that, as opposed to others from the outside trying to enforce behaviors in a protected area or some other site like that.
We have a question over here, and then we'll go online.
Hi, this is maybe a little bit tangential to some of the engagement with the private sector that we talked about today, but I've seen in the news recently a lot about the conservation angle for impact investing, and specifically impact bonds. And I'm wondering if any of you have had experience with those types of funding models, and if so, any kinds of challenges or successes engaging the private sector there.
No? All right.
No, go ahead.
Had discussions. There are a couple out there. The question is always risk. And that's where I think our investment people really look at what is the risk that's being asked of, and quite often a lot of the bonds that we've seen have too high a risk, but there are some places where there are ones that are in development that are looking promising.
No, I've looked at some of them. I have somewhat of a finance background, and I usually don't get them very well. A lot of people have been talking, and a lot of partnerships have been developed over the years to try to figure out how you create good conservation out of finance instruments, that can be bought and sold in exchanges. And I really haven't seen a really clear example where that's actually going to. And there might be some out there. I just haven't seen them. I just haven't seen it myself yet. And there's a rhino impact bond now I've seen, and some others that have come along, and I wonder why investors would want to put money in there, other than from a philanthropic standpoint.
Do you have a comment on that?
I
Yeah.
do.
Can we get you a microphone real quick, and then we'll go online?
Katie Garcia, I'm with Usaid. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. It's weird from this perspective. You can't really hear it. I'm in the Bureau for Food Security. Just a quick clarification. Impact bonds actually don't refer to like bonds in terms of impact, in terms of investment mechanisms. It actually refers to like the bond between organizations. So impact bonds are actually more related to incentivizing different behavior change. So there is social impact investing, right? And then impact bonds are actually related to changing behavior. So the one that USAID did most recently is around maternal child health in Rajasthan, India. So to really think about the ways that different actors along in the space related to maternal child health are doing things differently to have development outcomes. So there's development impact bonds and then the social impact bonds. And so there's like things that have been done in the UK related to impact bonds related to like getting more people to go to gyms. So how do you incentivize people to change their behaviors to go to gyms? So I think the term related to like bond is sort of sort of a funny term. So just sort of as a clarification in that sense. Impact investing, though, is a whole other thing, and there's a lot of really interesting space, which is actually quite clearly related to the private sector engagement, because it's all about leveraging resources from public and private places to be able to have greater development impact. So just sort of as a clarification that there could be impact bonds done in the conservation space, but it really depends on what it is we're trying to achieve. And then, as Mary was saying, it really goes to risk. Is it the best way to achieve what it is we're trying to achieve, or is it just sort of a new sort of trendy way to think about it? And there's thoughts out in different ways on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then online, Stacy, do you mind sharing that question?
Yeah. Is this on? Okay. So I'm just going to set this up a little bit. We've been talking a lot about private sector that is interested in conservation. So we have to counter that a little bit, we have a question from Trevor Jones at Southern Tanzania Elephant Program. Does the panel have any examples or experience of engaging private sector in conservation where that led to a company or corporation reducing a bad practice, for example, reducing plastic consumption, pollution, or greening their energy use?
Yeah.
There's an example. Hi, Trevor. There's an example. There's an example. In southern Madagascar, we were working with Rio Tinto, a large mining company, on titanium dioxide, and because of the general partnership with conservation organizations, instead of putting their port in one area, which was quite a sensitive, ecologically sensitive area, they did actually, just in the design of putting their port in, they did actually put the port, sited it in a different area. There were also cases where, again, because of this collaboration they had with many different conservation organizations, they actually agreed not to mine in certain areas because of the biodiversity in those given areas. So I think, yes, so that was a positive example that they actually made critical business decisions because they had early on focused on biodiversity, the biodiversity importance. They had gotten a consortium of conservation biologists together to really work with them and advise them and do a lot of the science.
I could give an example. It's sort of government and private sector, but in the Panama Canal zone, our scientists at our Tropical Research Institute used satellite tracking of humpback whales and there were problems with ship whale collisions, and they wanted to avoid that. So once the movement patterns of the whales were identified, they actually modified the shipping lanes and the speed which the ships were coming through and entering the canal area, and ship whale collisions have been reduced by 90%. In another government one, a similar idea with whale sharks in the Pacific Ocean, the same thing occurred, and once the awareness was raised about the movements and where they were and so on, the government increased the marine protected areas by about 12%. So it was a massive outcome based on scientific information that helped to understand the problem more clearly. So we have a lot of those examples actually, where whether it's government or private sector, oftentimes there's just ignorance about the problem itself. They know they have a problem, but they don't know really how to define the problem. And so if you can frame your science or your contribution in a way that helps to inform the problem and presents a solution, it's very important to stop hammering people with the problem without offering a solution. This is why I'm saying we have to be more focused on what works and why and how we can do more of that. I just put a plug in. We have this thing called the Earth Optimism Summit. And we did it in 2017, and everybody just felt beaten up with gloom and doom, nothing but bad stories. And yet we wanted to say there's a lot of things that do work, and there are a lot of good companies, a lot of good government actions, a lot of good scientific and conservation actions that are making a difference. And we tend to get overwhelmed, with climate change, the world's coming to an end, a million species are being lost. Those are all true things, but it shouldn't paralyze us to stop from recognizing that when we have something that works, how do we do more of it? How do we share that knowledge? How do we focus on solutions? So we're doing the 50th anniversary of Earth Day is coming up in April, and we're aligned with Earth Day Network, and we're blowing this out. There'll be hundreds of events around the world over that 3-day weekend, and we'll be sharing around the world stories of success and what works. How do we go towards a solutions mindset? So I think that's an important thing. We have to include the private sector in there. They have to be part of that, as I've already referred to by John. The conservation community is tiny relative to the massive money that exists in governments and private sector. If we don't embrace that or work with that, we'll never be successful.
Yes.
I also have an example of behavior change from China, which is part of the USAID Wildlife Asia project. We are working, ivory carving has a long history in Chinese culture, but we noticed that before China banned the ivory trade and during the tsunami of demand, we saw that the appreciation of ivory carving or appreciation of the craftsmanship shifted to appreciating ivory just as a material, as white gold. And so we are working with a museum in China to encourage people to appreciate, ivory carvings in museum only. And so in setting up the exhibit and working with the museum, we also told them the problem, now that China banned elephant ivory trade, but there are people who are using mammoth ivory as a cover for elephant ivory. And so we mentioned this to the museum, and what the museum did permanently is to remove their mammoth ivory carvings from their gift shops, even after the exhibit end. So this is kind of a behavior change. That sustained behavior change is the impact of this kind of relationship.
Thank you. We are good, I think. So I just thank you very much to the panel and to all of the questions and comments from everybody. I really appreciate it. The one question I didn't get to that I might get to during our little networking is just what is missing? Where do we have missing links? And what does the future look like as we evolve this relationship with the private sector? What I do want to do is just invite Peter Collier up before we break. He is the chief of party on our Usaid Wildlife Asia program, which Grace just referred to. And we just want to give you we want to showcase one video to you. So I would ask the panelists if you please want to sit in the front row. And then once he's completed, I will say my last words.
Great, thank you, Kathy. Good morning, everyone. So I'll just introduce the following clip, which is from one of two campaigns which we launched this past Friday in Bangkok, Thailand, together with the U.S. ambassador and 5 famous Thai celebrities and what we're calling fashion influencers. And it's the campaign is called Beautiful Without Ivory, and the key message is using ivory is never beautiful, never acceptable, and it's part of the demand reduction component of USAID Wildlife Asia. The strategy for the campaign among all of our demand reduction campaigns is based on the social behavior change communication approach, which does a lot of testing to identify and target and ultimately change people's perceptions, motivations around certain behaviors, and then to change those actual behaviors, in this case, buying ivory. So the 5 influencers, all kitchen table names in Thailand, include supermodels, famous supermodel and actress, a celebrity chef, a celebrity photographer, Miss Thailand and Miss Universe, and a TV host and entrepreneur. Let's see. In addition to their private sector contributions, since they're all entrepreneurs in themselves, We're working with an array of jewelry brands and retail associations that are all committing to not selling any products using ivory. So it's a great example of working with the private sector. Before we show the clip, I'll have to say when we were developing the campaign, I was sort of like, I'm not sure this is strong enough. The message it could be a little stronger, but when you see the clip, you'll see that the sheer attitude that these influencers project is so forceful that I think it pushes it over the edge into quite a strong campaign. So without further ado, let's see the clip.
คุณคิดว่าใส่งาแล้วสวยเหรอแบบนี้สวยกว่าคุณคิดว่าใส่งาช้างแล้วดูดีเหรอแบบนี้สิดูดีกว่าคิดว่างาแฟชั่นเหรอแบบนี้แฟชั่นกว่าใส่งาช้างแล้วดูแพงเหรอแบบเนี้ยดูแพงกว่าคุณคิดว่าใส่งาช้างแล้วจะเป็นที่ยอมรับเหรอไม่ค่ะมันไม่ควรเป็นสิ่งที่ยอมรับได้เพราะความสวยอยู่ที่ใจไม่ใช่ที่งาช้างไม่ใช่ของสวยงามและไม่เป็นที่ยอมรับ
Very cool. I finally got to see that this morning, and I get chills every time I see the pregnant woman because it just says a lot, I think. It's got a lot of unspoken comments on that video. A huge thank you to everybody that was working behind the scenes, preparing for this. This was not a small feat. It took a lot of people, and I had a lot of support. So thank you so much for that. The tech team, the communications team, RTI, LEAD for providing us this venue, and opportunity to pull all of this together. The Climate, Natural Resource, and Water team under RTI that really helped with all of the volunteering this morning. And a huge debt of gratitude to the panel. Thank you so much. I think we gained a lot of insight. I learned a lot, especially with the diversity of all of the work that you do in conservation. So a huge thank you, and I hope to see you again soon.